Senator Bragg.
Thanks very much, Acting Deputy President. I rise to take note of the Tax Law Amendment Bill to Rent Bill and Capital Works Bill to Rent Misuse Tax Bill 2024. Now, this is a bizarre priority when the nation is very focused on housing issues, whether you are a younger person or an older person, to have a government in Canberra for almost 3 years to have prioritised giving a tax cut to foreign corporations, foreign fund managers, could be BlackRock, Vanguard, it could be a sovereign wealth fund, to give a tax cut to foreign entities so that they can purchase Australian houses and construct houses in this country that Australians will never, ever own, is beyond bizarre. Now, this model of perpetual renting, underpinned by this government has decided that it would prioritise the interests of foreign fund managers over the punters. That is the reality. And that is why it has now passed through in a guillotine at the end of last year a bill that prioritises the interests of foreign fund managers. Because this, of course, suits the foreign fund managers, but it also suits the great benefactors of the organised labour movement today, the super funds. It suits them down to a T. And in fact, in a public hearing into this bill, I was able to ask the Association of Super Funds what they thought of the idea. And I said, do you think the Australian people want to rent their house from a super fund? And Mr Clare, who was the official from the ASFA, said, I think that they would be very happy with institutionally owned residential property. Now, I think that Mr Clare is wrong, and I think the government has a warped set of priorities because it is a government for vested interest, which is underpinned here by this agenda. Now, Cameron Murray, who's an independent economist, has said that most houses in Australia today are owned directly by Australians. 67% are owned by homeowners and over 30% by private individuals. And then there's public housing. But the whole idea of build to rent is to turf the individual out and to bring in the institution. And that's what you do when you run the country for 3 years for a few vested interests. Now, when we had an opportunity to talk to the people on the front line of the housing crisis, the Housing Industry Association, and asked them, where would this priority sit? If you were going to try and solve the nation's housing crisis, where would this priority sit, build to rent? Would it be in your top 10 issues? And they told the committee that was examining this bill that it would not be in the top 20 or 30. Because, of course, the reason that housing is such a major issue, and the reason that younger Australians in particular feel that the Australian dream is getting further and further out of reach, is because housing construction has collapsed under this government. It takes longer than ever to assemble a deposit. And the government's solutions do not work in the main. Now, if you look at the data going back into the last few parliaments, the former government built almost 200,000 houses in each year on average. Now, it went as high as 220,000 houses. 220,000 houses. He's very sensitive, isn't he, Acting Deputy President? He's very sensitive about this. So we've gone from almost 200,000 houses built in Australia per year under the coalition to 170,000 on average under this government. So despite all the huffing and puffing and all the bureaucracies and Housing Australia Future Funds and all the other garbage policies this government has built bureaucracies, not houses. The government has built bureaucracies and not houses. That is the reality. And the government's embarrassed, and Senator Ayres is embarrassed, and I'm sorry that he's embarrassed, but the numbers don't lie. The numbers do not lie. We are down to 170,000 on average, and we need 250,000. 250,000. So housing construction has collapsed, and then we have the issue of the never-ending deposit time, extending and extending. Under this government, most Australians will now have to wait another 14 months until they get a deposit. Depressing, isn't it? And then to make matters worse, Labor's solution, Help to Buy, won't get you a house in almost every capital city. And in fact, in Sydney, my home state, just 14% of the houses in Sydney are eligible for the scheme, only 6% in Western Australia. So quite depressing. But my main point is, before wrapping up and giving other people a chance to say something, is that this was a war priority to advance an agenda around giving a tax cut to foreign asset managers. I think when the government is able to look at this in the cold light of day, they will probably also admit that they would have been better off to have been working on trying to get houses built, trying to help people bridge the deposit gap, rather than running the government in favour of their favourite vested interests, which, generally speaking, are the super funds. But in this case, they have been trying to tilt the scales in favour of foreign asset managers and foreign sovereign wealth funds, and allowing them to become the perpetual landlords to Australians, which most Australians would say is a sick distortion of the Australian dream. And this is why housing is in such a terrible mess under this government.